there are two areas of planning expertise that went along with this, because we have an excellent panel here today that's going to really provide some great insight, probably scare you a little bit, but really, you'll have some good takeaways to take home with you back to your companies as well as on a personal level. But the first is, I notice we're after lunch, and I'm assuming that's just because we're the most interesting topic, right? So we want to keep everybody engaged. We are on a tight time frame, so I promise I will try to leave some room for questions afterwards, but I spoke with all the panelists, and we will be around for a little bit after our sessions as well if you do have any further questions, but please hold them till the end so we can get through the material that we do have planned. The other thing is the tremendous insight that Peter and team had in planning this conference with everything that's been going on in California right now, right? With the Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital and the Apple scandal and all of those things going on. So, I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit of that. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Immediately to my left, we have Special Agent Gabriel Andrews. Special Agent Gabriel Andrews investigates computer intrusions and internet-enabled crime at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Los Angeles field office. And despite recent news, as I alluded to, he wants nothing to do with your iPhone. Immediately to his left is Mike Bell, who is currently the president of Infrascale. Infrascale protects corporate and government data by sending it to the cloud for instant recovery in the event of a disaster or security breach, which I think that we know some companies that could have used your help. Infrascale is venture-backed with headquarters in Los Angeles. The company employs 160 people worldwide and operates a dozen data centers around the globe. And immediately to his left, we have Chris Cheppy, who is a 15-year cybersecurity veteran and a recognized leader in the digital identity space. In both technical and executive roles, he has pioneered technologies including cross-domain authentication, which are fundamental to cloud security. Chris is currently founder and CEO of Situational, the leading provider of context-driven cybersecurity. So as you can see, we have a lot of good information that'll be coming your way. To open it up, just so that, really with the transition of people deciding at their organizations, should we use the cloud? Why should I use the cloud? How would I go about doing it? All of those questions that are going through people's minds at this time. I'd like to just kick it to Mike and ask you, how are private enterprise companies balancing the movement of cloud, the threat of the perceived threat to data security?
Well, I guess I'll answer by saying some are and some are not. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of private enterprise companies who are, particularly the smaller companies, who are early adopters. They're the ones you could imagine, tech companies that have no issue with security other than acknowledging it for just a risk of doing business, and they do everything they can to mitigate that risk. But we see a lot of companies at the other end of the spectrum, companies that, despite all of the benefits that come with cloud technologies, are just saying no, and they're just resisting it, and they have no plan for adoption, and it's a little bit like hiding their head in the sand. They just are putting all those benefits aside until a safer day, and I don't know when that'll ever come, but we definitely see companies in the middle, but also on either end of those spectrums.
Thank you. And I think, that's some great insight, because even as I see people ask me questions and they tell them what I do as far as cybersecurity is concerned, and they get the immediately blank stare and I have no idea what you're talking about. I won't have any conversation that, is intelligent with you. But that's not the case, and they're really simple concepts to really try to start understanding, and people now don't have the choice. They really, all of you have to really understand what's going on in the cloud space and the cyberspace. And having said that, Gabriel, next to you, when we speak of moving from privately managed infrastructure to cloud services, what common types of fraud or cybercrime are we potentially increasing exposure to?
All right, so I'd like to predicate the answer by saying that I typically see things when they go horribly, horribly awry. So I don't often see just the normal, everyday, great working environments that probably are the norm here. So please don't take any of these topics as being like, targeting cloud infrastructure. No. But one of the main things you have to be cognizant of is that most of the crime that we encounter doesn't actually occur through technical penetration or technical intrusions. It's most often done by tricking people. It's lying online, right? The internet just allows people to lie farther. So when you talk about putting your data in the cloud, just be aware of what you're putting out there, and then be aware of okay, how could I possibly impersonate my own company here to get access to that data? And if I did, what data would they get? And what would that allow me to then laterally move to? So there's I guess there's a lot of infrastructure you could use. If you're using email off of Microsoft 365, right? Email's no longer in your control. A lot of us use personal accounts of Gmail and whatnot, but it's only as secure as their tech support is and their password recovery system is. And one of the key cases we saw about this was the Scarlett Johansson, what was it called? Hackerazzi case. We liked that word. It sounded cool. But we thought initially it was an iPhone intrusion, and we got excited because we were really looking for instances of malware targeting iPhone in the wild. And after a lot of investigating and beating our heads against the wall, someone had the bright idea to actually go check her iCloud account. And it turned out the bad guy, his technical expertise was as sophisticated as being able to guess her security questions and then changing the forwarding email address information on the account. And from that point forward, every email that she received was going to him. And from there, he was able to move laterally to other celebrities, similarly guess their passwords, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever you're signing up for a new service, I guess the overarching thread I want to just put in your minds there is just be aware that there's going to be someone there that's in customer service that will restore access to your account, and you want them to be helpful, but not too helpful. All right? So that's my point on that.
No, that's a great point. And I think, now we live in a world of instant gratification, right? We don't have 5 minutes to do anything. We're always too busy. So, it speaks a lot to what Chris was alluding to. So obviously in the case of Scarlett Johansson, you can see kind of why, because of the fame and the notoriety of the individual that was being hacked. But Chris, what are some of the economic incentives for an attack to occur for hackers?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think what I've observed in the security industry relative to the cloud is a bias toward not doing it, being sensitive to moving data into the cloud because of the security risks, kind of what has already been discussed on the panel. But the pendulum has actually swung to looking at cloud providers as being the only reliable source of security expertise that you can reliably run your business on. So if you think about the simplicity of the attacks that we're talking about, these account hijacking, where someone sends an email to you where you click on a link and provide your credential. That attack is very common. Google sees it the most, and they have the most resource to put defending against it. So you can think of the resilience that a company that has the resources of Google can put against a spear phishing attack, which is the most common way that data gets breached. But if you're Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, what kind of resources do you have to put against investing in resilience in your systems to defend against a spear phishing attack? In Hollywood Press, you're just as vulnerable to the database admin who gets an email and falls for it, right? So the simplicity of the attacks is actually a reason to move data to the cloud. And I think the simplicity of the attacks, they're so broad, and the sophistication required from a technical perspective to invest in the resilience to defend against these attacks is actually an incentive for moving to the cloud. And another thing that's out of balance is that the economic incentive for the attackers is higher than the economic incentive for a typical small, medium-sized business to invest in security. So that's why you see an old hospital, a medium-sized hospital, that's a very attractive target for probably not that sophisticated an attacker. They settled that for $17,000, they decrypted. So that's not a big score there. That's not probably rocket scientists. That's a pretty mundane attack against a very attractive target. And so if you think of the economic drivers of that, that's just going to push more technology to the cloud where there is this pool of talent and expertise.
I figured a hospital probably would have paid more too, right?
You think? I think we still have to kind of parse through the data.
Right, but so we're in the data protection business, and oftentimes when our customers lose data to ransomware, oftentimes rather than just recovering it, restoring it from our cloud, they're choosing to pay the ransom. Why? Because the ransom dollars are low enough, and a lot of times they seem absurdly low compared to the value of the data. But I think the ransomware hackers are pricing the cost of recovery or the cost of the ransom based on the price of recovery, not the intrinsic value of the data, which is one of the reasons it's $1,000 or $2,000, you write the check. It's just so much cheaper and quicker, and it's actually come to be reliable, as it's sadly to say, versus getting the data back from the cloud and reinstalling it and recovering it the normal way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just going along with that, and I think you guys have touched upon it, and I want to kick it to Gabriel a little bit to expand some more and color from each of you. But as far as, is ransomware the most current trend that you're seeing in cybersecurity? What are some of the current trends that you're seeing as far as crime and fraud?
Yeah, ransomware is definitely prevalent. So we saw that in the news. There was actually a huge international takedown just last year that was called the CryptoLocker takedown. And CryptoLocker was one of the first big flavors of ransomware, but obviously it hasn't gone away. So I don't expect it will go away anytime soon either. I think it's relatively well understood by the bad guys, so it's going to stick around. But it still requires some level of technical sophistication to, I think, really implement it. And what we're seeing more of these days than anything is stuff that doesn't take very much technical sophistication at all, particularly this scheme that we call the business email compromise. And I just want to take this opportunity to speak to everyone in this room. Out of curiosity, how many of you are involved in businesses that do wire transfers, either sending or receiving, decently regular basis? Boom. Okay, this is why. The bad guys used to just pop into an email account. They'd compromise it likely through a spearfish, as was stated, because it's a very common means of compromising a computer. And once in an email account, they could see, like, oh, this person asked for wire transfers. I'll send a request just like he does, use the same language he does to the same person, the same time of day, and very often it went through. Later, they found out they don't even have to do that. They could just register a website domain that very closely mimics your website, do 5 minutes on Google to figure out who the CEO is and what his email address is, and just pretend to be him. And if you don't notice the typo, and you don't do some sort of out-of-band authentication about the request, that money's gone. And there's the case of a tech firm here in the LA area that actually lost on the order of $47 million, and the email address used to request the wire was actually something as ridiculous as like CEO@gmail.com. And it's just a matter of being so busy and so familiar with this process, you sort of lose sight of the risk. And so I just want to make sure everyone is aware, this is very prevalent right now, and you need some sort of out-of-band, out of the email authentication here. An email is not a person. And if I can only get one point across to you all day, that's it. An email is never a person. Pick up the phone, walk across the hall. We've actually notified a victim before who was adamant the wire request was real, and we caught it in real time before they were aware. Asked them to double check. They said, no, it's real. No, please, can you double check? We heard them on the phone shouting across the hall to the CEO. It was that close, and they hadn't yet authenticated. So just do your due diligence. It's to the tune of $2 billion a year globally.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We've actually had a couple of cases. An R and an N next to each other look very close to an M. You know, that's a
Absolutely.
Very easy one to duplicate or stick an I in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to pick up to the blind eye, especially if you're going 100 miles an hour through the course of your normal day. I just want to give Mike and Chris a chance. Is there anything different than what Gabriel said as far as what you've been seeing out there?
People are the problem, yeah. I mean, the challenge is that typically with security, there's a tension between user experience and security. So if you think of the CEO accidentally wiring $47 million, there probably would be technical steps along the way to do double checking or to do additional factors of authentication or authorization. But they often interrupt the flow of business, and so when that tension has existed, the user experience has always won out. But I think we're entering a world where the calculable risk of data breaches and of having ransomware hit your business or the calculable risk of that is high enough so that there actually is this impetus to make security stronger, even at the cost of user experience. And I think that's another trend that you see. I will say that, my background is a lot in authentication, and the methods of two-factor authentication are problematic. They often interrupt the user experience. They're out of band, but a lot of times they're using the phone as the second factor, which is a temporary solution because the phone is increasingly the first factor of compute. I can do wire transfers from my phone when I run my business, so I wouldn't want my second factor on my phone. So it's a complicated space, and again, this is this trend toward relying on larger vendors to handle security. Someone who can implement stronger factors of authentication without interrupting user, someone who's not going to be subject to ransomware because they're running across a multi-tenant cloud platform that's not subject to that threat. And I think the Global 2000 customers that we sell to are becoming more and more comfortable with AWS and Google and Salesforce and just cloud platform across the board.
Okay, so educating our people, since they're our biggest problem right now. That's one of the countermeasures that we have. The authentication is another countermeasure. Do you want to just speak about some of the pros and cons, and then also, Mike, maybe you could add some color as far as the solutions that your organization provides as well.
Pros and cons of the different remedies?
Countermeasures, yeah, countermeasures.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, it's situational. We're taking this approach where we're kind of flipping the script and saying it's not information you can collect from the user, like their password or a one-time password or a token that they push to you from their phone, but it's information you can sense about the user, like their geographic location or their expected patterns of behavior. And I think we're in kind of this next-gen class of security vendors that are using telemetry in real time as an implicit second factor. So if someone's authenticating or impersonating the CEO, you have a better likelihood of determining that that's an imposter, because you're going beyond just a credential or a role that the user has. You're going to these actual pieces of contextual information. That's why we call our approach context-driven, contextual information related to the user who's authenticating. So that's the approach that we're on the kind of the cutting edge of implementing. And I think that's where we strike this balance between user experience, where we can do this checking behind the scenes. You can think of the implicit decisions you make every day based on someone's appearance or how, there's things you do in the background that don't involve an explicit interaction with someone. And so that's the type of approach we're applying to cybersecurity. And I think that's directionally where the industry is headed.
Instead of 100% trust and just clicking a button, right? It's
Seamless,
some
but
other layer.
high trust. High trust.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then I guess, Mike, what market segments are leading and which ones are lagging in kind of the movement to the cloud, and what are you seeing?
Okay, sure. So government is lagging. We see really tech
Hopefully not
companies.
soon, though, with Obama's new plan. But.
Yeah, who knows? We'll see, right? I'll stay out of political discussion. I'm going to give you tomatoes thrown at me. So government entities, we see, for example, companies, the technology that we sell and provide is meant to be put in the cloud, and we see increasingly companies choose to put the technology that backs up and replicates their data, they choose to keep it on premise. If you think about that for a second, they're choosing the risk of a natural disaster or a fire or loss or theft or anything else over the risk of theft, or I'm sorry, the risk of hacking or any kind of cloud threat. Not necessarily logical, and a massive trade-off instead of figuring out a way to balance or mitigate those risks or actually handle them with a more intelligent solution. So we see companies, primarily education and government entities that are kind of far right. The trends, the second part of your question, the trends that we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of private enterprise companies, like mid-market companies, create their own private clouds. I'm not sure if technically they're any more secure or not, but I think emotionally, IT people feel like if they can keep it on-prem and create their own data center in their own facility, that fundamentally that's safer. And because they can see it and feel it and touch it and put it behind a firewall and lock the door, in their view, it protects them against threats that might exist in the cloud in some server that they can't see or don't know where it's at. So we call that the private cloud, and there's just a lot of emerging trends towards both private cloud hardware as well as private cloud software and solutions.
Great, thank you. I was just checking the time a little bit, and I'm assuming that you guys have a decent amount of questions. We do have some more to run through, but I actually want to give you guys the opportunity for anything that you have. I mean, you have at your disposal expert panelists right now that can answer anything that you throw out to us. We've probably heard everything before, so please don't be intimidated to ask a question if you do have one. Sure.
I'll start with the topical one. We read a lot about Secretary Clinton transferring from government servers into an own personal server. And I'd like to know, is that just illegal or what, or was that
All eyes go to the FBI.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's me. It was implied, was it not?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
Gabriel is sort of strung because he's on video and he's a FBI. But, I mean, the Hillary Clinton email case, the Hollywood Presbyterian case, and even the Apple phone decryption controversy, they all revolve around who has the power to decrypt, right? And so Hillary said, I'm not going to trust these other governmental agencies to manage the encryption and decryption of my communications. The ransomware attackers, they say, we're going to take over the power to encrypt and decrypt your data, and we're going to hold you ransom for that. And in the case of this lawsuit between Apple and the federal government, that's about, does the technology vendor have to give the government the capability of decrypting? And I think it's all this sort of cutting edge thing. And I think as citizens, we would like the power to be able to control that and have some say in that, and there's privacy concerns around that. But in certain cases, that power is going to have to be shared, right? I mean, it's shared with the technology providers where you store your data by default. And then, so it'll be interesting to track that. It's less of a technology issue. It's more of where do we draw the line of who has the power to encrypt and decrypt data.
And just a takeaway on one of those cases, having a security guard outside of your server room will not deter hackers. That's one thing they will not protect. So that's not something you can answer back to the government if you've been breached, saying that's strong controls. Yes.
Can you speak to kind of both sides of this hacking debate? And on the surface, it seems like my high school kids' friends and hacking into cell phones. How would the government have a difficult time doing this? Why is Apple assisting this at such a great degree to decrypt one single phone? What are the real debate behind the scenes? I mean, why Apple taking the deals in and not by the government? What's their resistance?
I could start with just saying what the request was, because it's public. It's been published there, which started this whole conversation. And the conversation is a good conversation to have. Let's make that abundantly clear. It's great to have people engaged in this kind of topic, right? It's an incentive to educate yourself. In this particular case, it was a Apple 5C, an older model that was being discussed, and though Apple has in the past offered a service to law enforcement to assist with the decryption of phones, at some point in the past, I don't know exactly when, they stopped offering that service. And about the same time, there was a shift to newer phones that they no longer had the decryption ability for, right? And so it was mostly concurrent. They said, newer phones, we can't do that for, and there it is. And that was where it was going to lie. But in this particular case, someone very clever came up with a workaround that might work in this instance, and that is, in order to unlock this phone, just anyone has the phone, right? You turn on the screen, you have to enter a code. On the 5C, you have 10 tries built in by the software before it'll decrypt or delete the decryption key. Additionally, if you try several times in a row too fast, it'll slow it down, your attempts, to limit you to one attempt per 5 seconds. And then finally, the operating system forces any input to be done on the screen as opposed to the port or Wi-Fi. And those are the three things that were requested in the order to be just struck from the operating system code, right? If you did those three things, then someone could conceivably set up a computer program to just brute force, which is to say guess and guess and guess and guess until you guess right the unlock code for the phone. The issue at hand is that in order to modify the operating system and actually run it, it has to be signed. There's this notion of digital authentication, like signing with a private key, and the phone will check the operating system before it allows it to run. Can't run, no go. So even if the FBI or contractors on our behalf were able to make those changes to the OS, phone wouldn't run it. There's only one entity in the world that has the private key necessary to sign it. And so, as a law enforcement officer, typically when you make these sort of requests and they fall outside the norm, you more or less are at the mercy of the judges in the court. You make your case, you demonstrate all the articulable facts, you show why there's absolutely no way you can do what you're seeking to do without this one solution that you propose, and then you ask the courts to decide. And as a law enforcement officer, you typically view that as the final word. And so this is an interesting thing to observe when the court has then issued an order and it isn't complied with. And so it's interesting to see where it goes from there. That in itself is sort of a novel precedent, right? As to Apple's point of view, I don't wish to speculate, but perhaps one of these gentlemen might chime in.
Well, if I owned Apple and ran Apple, I would be concerned that my products became viewed as tools for surveillance downstream. So that would be a long-term business concern that I would have about selling more iPhones next year and the year after and the year after that. If my products become viewed as conduits for surveillance, for broader surveillance, that would be the outcome. I wouldn't be so concerned as a single device. Apparently there's 47 other devices. So I think that's probably the bigger business picture that they're playing, and it'll be decided based on legal technicality. I think it probably is justified, the request that's being made, and so the Supreme Court will ultimately most likely decide. But you can see where Apple would want to draw a boundary, and at least have it work itself out rather than just agreeing. Just purely from how I'm running a business, like not thinking of any of the other societal or privacy issues.
Is there any truth to the whole back-door conversation that we keep seeing on the news? Hey, if we show them on, I didn't even know about the 5C, so what I just hear is, hey, it's 5C, are we making me more, let the guy in and let's save our lives, right?
I'm not an expert on this issue, but to my understanding, this technique that's being discussed would not work on newer model phones. And there's a difference in the actual hardware that would prevent this technique from being employed. I don't wish to come across as trying to be the expert there, right? So just staying that. It's my understanding at this time. Though I would like to also make sure that, to whatever extent I did or didn't say this in my prior response, privacy is very important, and we treat that so very seriously. I don't want you to have the impression in any way, shape, or form that this is somehow a key that would then be turned in every phone that's out there. It would be an instance that's employed here, and perhaps part of the hesitation on Apple's part is they see that if they capitulate with this request, there might be many more requests in the future, again compelling them to capitulate. But I don't believe that we're seeking their private key. We're not seeking to have possession of this modified OS. Rather, we're seeking assistance with its employment, if that makes sense. Yes, quite literally. That was in the order. I think it was offered they would bring the phone to, I think it's Cupertino, and allow Apple to maintain possession of whatever tools are necessary throughout entirety, so long as we could remote in to do an evidentiary review. Many. I don't know what the time frame is. It's my understanding that there was a period, I thought it was more than a few hours, but again, and without having strict numbers, all I can say is that there is evidence that may exist on the phone that was not cloud backed up due to the fact that his backups weren't continuous. And so, as Comey said in the news recently, he feels that it's owed to the families of the victims to exhaust all investigative leads. And it's as simple as that. By no means do we think that there is a 100% chance of smoking gun on this phone. But we can't ignore the possibility that there's evidence there that would actually benefit the investigation.
Okay. I think maybe one more question. Okay, last question in the back.
You spoke about the trend towards more private cloud services or within companies. How is that technically different than just a server? I mean, are we just, if you work at a company that just has your server, are we just calling a server when you're calling something a cloud? Is it just the same?
You're right on. There's no material distinction. A cloud is a data room, and if it's in rack space or if it's in your own, on premise, it's still a cloud. So there's no meaningful distinction. I think potentially, the only meaningful distinction that I can think of is just the physical security of like a human being breaching the data room. Other than that, it's no different than putting in a public cloud.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank my panelists today for their expertise. We knew Apple would come out.